Quickly, before we begin, most of you will be aware that I was banned from YouTube and that this video is a re-upload. I just wanted to say thank you very much for watching and that the journey shall now continue on Rumble. Now more than ever, I should be much more reliant on your kind donations and subscriptions so that I can keep making these videos. So, if you enjoy this video, or if you've learned from my videos in the past and had ever considered donating or subscribing, then please do check the link in the description and sign up if you just want to support me or join our private Discord and Telegram. Thank you. Before I first began this channel, just over 2 months ago, there were 2 videos that inspired me to come back to YouTube after 5 years of not uploading and to make history videos. Both were by the same channel, Potential History. The first was a video titled Germany Could Not Win World War II, which I thought was an interesting concept, so I made a video of my own along the exact same lines, and the channel didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. The second video was a video titled Dresden, a justifiable target, and it was quite literally 8 minutes of not only endorsing, but also joking about genocide.
This is now an Arthur Harris video. Arthur Brit RAF Lit AF Harris. Arthur Bankrupting Fire Insurance since 1945 Harris. Arthur Fire Up the Lancasters Harris. Arthur Holocaust Mark II Lancaster Boogaloo Harris.
Seeing a man an entire ocean away, with no proper understanding of events, making jokes and laughing from his bedroom 73 years later like this, inspired me to make this video. And this video is dedicated to all those civilians on both sides, whether it be a small boy watching his mother get blown to pieces in Coventry by German bombs, or a grandfather watching his entire family get melted into nothing but a puddle of fat by British firebombs in Hamburg. When we read about the Second World War, or any history for that matter, a lot of the horrible things we read come off as just words on a page, and we carry on about our day, not thinking about it too deeply. But when it comes to the Allied terror bombing campaigns of the Second World War, things are different. Reading accounts of the people on the ground during the genocide is physically hard to read. I had to stop several times, and it literally made me feel ill. The events are totally glossed over, because as we know, the victors write the narrative. In fact, here in Britain, our bombing campaigns were never mentioned in history class. Let's discuss what actually happened, and why it was a uniquely evil and criminal event, the likes of which the world had never seen before. War isn't quite as simple as good guys and bad guys, after all. Even before the Second World War had begun, propaganda in media of all forms was so pervasive and unending against Germany that it was having real effects on both politicians and everyday people alike. In the lead up to war, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain would latch onto the most ridiculous hoaxes, thinking they were real, because fear of Germany conquering all of Europe was such a constant theme. When a fake war scare came up that Germany was about to invade Romania, a country Germany didn't even border, Chamberlain fired off war guarantees to a whole handful of countries in Europe. The consequential one being Poland, which halted negotiations dead between the Germans and the Poles over Danzig. Poland could now do whatever she liked, as she knew Britain would be there to back her up. When war actually did come about, the all too familiar themes of the First World War anti-German propaganda reared their head once more, but this time they were dialed up to the maximum. In his popular 1941 book, Germany Must Perish, author Theodor Kaufmann wrote, "This time, Germany has forced a total war upon the world. As a result, she must be prepared to pay a total penalty, and there is one, and only one, such total penalty. Germany must perish forever. In fact, not in fancy. The goal of world domination must be removed from the reach of the German, and the only way to accomplish this is to remove the German from the world. There remains then but one mode of ridding the world forever of Germanism, and that is to stem the source from which issue those war-lusted souls by preventing the people of Germany from ever producing their kind again." He was dead serious. He proposed that all Germans be sterilised, and that Germany be partitioned among its neighbours. This wasn't just some lunatic talking to himself. Many people were all on board. Time magazine said it was, quote, "a sensational idea," and the Washington Post called it a provocative theory. At first, most Westerners found ideas such as these sickening, but eventually, propaganda wore down at their Christian ideals most had been brought up with, and as the war dragged on, the media and government alike had created a sizable chunk of the population that simply saw no difference between killing a German soldier and killing innocent German women and children. A British naval officer summed up the British people's thoughts at the time. Germans were first cousins to the devil. The population of the British Isles had been worked up by propaganda to a state of passionate hatred of Hitler, the Nazi Party, the German armed forces, and the German people. They had been told repeatedly that the only good German is a dead one. More influentially, back in the US, Henry Morgenthau called for 2/3 of the German population to be killed by starvation and thousands more shot out of hand. Winston Churchill agreed after a little convincing, and President Roosevelt agreed immediately, before a handful of influential men whose Christian morals could not stomach such things stepped in and caused a scene which spared the Germans at least this fate. In the East, one of the most influential writers in the Soviet Union, and perhaps the entire world, targeted his propaganda at the average Red Army soldier. He said, "The Germans are not human beings. If you have not killed at least one German a day, you have wasted that day. If you cannot kill your German with a bullet, kill him with your bayonet. There is nothing more amusing for us than a heap of German corpses. Do not count days. Count only the number of Germans killed by you. Kill the German. That is your grandmother's request. Kill the German. That is your child's prayer. Kill the German. That is your motherland's loud request. Do not miss. Do not let through. Kill, kill. Red Army men, kill. No fascist is innocent. Be he alive, be he as yet unborn." The message was heard loud and clear by the average soldier, and many obeyed to the word. The events that fell upon the German people on the Eastern Front are uniquely horrifying in their own regard, but they are a story for another day. All this is to say, though, propaganda works. A handful of men with evil thoughts in control of the media or in the government can quickly turn a not insignificant amount of the population into bloodthirsty savages. By 1945, the bombing of German cities was nothing new. Winston Churchill had initiated this early in the war by beginning the indiscriminate bombing of population centres. After holding his nerve and not wanting to take part in this horrible game, eventually Hitler replied in kind, and the back and forth bombing of cities began. By 1945, more bombs had fallen on Berlin alone than the Germans had dropped on all of England combined. It was believed that the mass slaughter of civilians, as well as making many times more homeless, coupled with the destruction of ancient cities and priceless artworks, would annihilate German morale. It didn't take much convincing for Churchill to be won over to this idea by Arthur Harris, the chief of British Bomber Command. Over time, the bombing escalated, and the destruction became more and more hellish. The Germans barely had the capability to reply as the war entered its final years. Hitler expressly forbid kamikaze attacks, stating that Germans must always have a chance to survive, no matter how small, and that they were not like the Japanese. However, his V-1 and V-2 rockets did cause chaos in London when they were finally operational. The destruction was nothing compared to that inflicted upon Hitler's own cities, however. As 1945 rolled around, almost every major city was effectively a pile of barely functioning rubble. A prime example being Hamburg, which was burnt to a crisp by firebombs for over a week straight, resulting in up to 100,000 civilian deaths, and that's just US figures. The lower range is around 40,000 by British sources. It was a prelude of what was to come in Dresden. Civilians that weren't killed by shrapnel or burnt alive directly by the bombs were sucked into the vortex, melted into the hellishly hot pavement, asphyxiated by burst gas pipes in their shelters, or worse. Those jumping into the water to survive suffered from thermal radiation to the lungs and then ignited upon hitting the surface. A quote by Thomas Goodrich from the book Hellstorm sums up the scenes rather well. Due to the tremendous heat, some bunkers contained only dozens of log-like shapes, charred and shriveled to only a quarter of their original size. Dogs and cats had been reduced to the size of rats. In still other cellars, only a powdery grey ash remained. When rescuers entered some shelters, they found floors covered in up to a foot of greasy fat, the victims having been rendered into a dark, evil liquid. Similar scenes took place unceasingly across the Reich, this just being one example in a single city. By 1945, the end of the war was in sight, and a post-war plan was needed. So Churchill and Roosevelt met with Stalin at Yalta to discuss the future of this wasteland that was once the German nation. Somehow, all this death and destruction had not had the desired effect. German morale had actually increased as a result of the bombing. With the humiliation of the First World War still in somewhat recent memory, Germans knew that they had no choice but to fight till the end. The bombing only strengthened their feelings that these people, who were happy to roast children alive from the skies, were not to be negotiated with. One Berliner wrote in her diary, "I feel a growing sense of wild vitality within myself. If the British think that they are going to undermine our morale, they are barking up the wrong tree. They are not softening us up." Goebbels, the so-called master of propaganda himself, didn't even need to do his job. When making his rounds, helping the fire services with their task of putting out the flames after the bombing raids, he couldn't find the slightest sense of defeatism among the German people. Many seemed even more determined than him to see this through to the conclusion, whatever it may be. The Allies continued on with their strategy, however, and took it to new heights. At Yalta, in early February 1945, Stalin requested that the Allies commence a mass bombing campaign in eastern Germany to smooth the way for the advancing Red Army. Churchill and Roosevelt, who seemed to be trying to outdo each other in impressing Stalin every time they met, happily obliged. The target was obvious. It was the one that the mastermind of these bombing operations, Arthur Harris, had been begging them to hit for months now: Dresden. Dresden had been struck only twice so far in the war, and many had theories for why this was the case. Many residents in the city logically assumed that it was due to Dresden having a reputation for being a city of art. For centuries, it had been home to priceless, irreplaceable gems of Western civilization. Surely, even these terror bombers had the heart not to bomb a barely defended and militarily unimportant cultural centre hundreds of miles from their own front lines, or so the residents of this doomed city thought. The town had barely any industry to mention. It was regarded as a hospital city, and it was currently home to 26,000 Allied prisoners of war. Most of all, it was internationally regarded as a refugee town for those fleeing from the Red Army flooding over the Reich's eastern border. The normal population of 600,000 had ballooned to double that figure. Each restaurant, cafe, pub and bar was crammed full of people with suitcases, rucksacks and bundles. You literally fell over these people and their possessions. It was so bad that you did not like to watch it, and it spoiled all the usual happy atmosphere, wrote one woman. At the main train station, there was a kind of city within a city, full of lost or orphaned children, among others who had washed up in Dresden amid all the chaos. A 17-year-old Red Cross worker named Eva Bayer sets the scene in Dresden better than I can. Children were searching for their parents. Parents were searching for their children. There was constant calling and asking. A boy of about 9 years of age, holding his little 4-year-old sister by the hand, asked me for food. When I asked him where his parents were, the boy said to me, "Grandma and Grandpa are lying dead in the carriage, and Mummy is lost." The children had no tears anymore. In one compartment, we found a woman. She had 23 children with her, and not one of them was her own. She had buried her own child 3 weeks ago. Her child had died of cold and tonsillitis. I asked her where all these other children came from, and she told me that these were all children whose parents were lost or dead. After all, somebody's got to take care of them, she said. Those children's faces were not the faces of children anymore. They were the faces of people who had gone straight through hell. Starving, wounded, lice-ridden, in rags. And the most treasured thing they had, security and the love of their parents, they had lost. End quote. Dresden being the hotspot for refugees and lost children was no secret. This was public information, and the Allies were well aware of this city being a kind of safe haven. They chose it anyway. After all, by 1945, the difference in many Allied minds between German soldiers and German civilians was narrowing by the day. Wouldn't this make the biggest splash of all? Would this massive act of devilish destruction not take the Germans past their breaking point and crush their morale? Fasching is a German event, kind of like Mardi Gras. It fell on the 13th of February. In all of Germany, celebrations did not go ahead like normal due to the war, except in one city. Dresden was still in a fit enough state for celebrations to go ahead, and that evening, the locals flooded into the streets to partake in a much-needed break from the stress of war and enjoy themselves. The city was a mass of people. At 10 p.m, however, the sirens sounded. Most ignored the sounds. Why would this alarm be any different to the 171 other false alarms that came before it? Instead of the usual signal to inform them that all was clear, the citizens of Dresden heard a different noise. It was the rumbling of the Allied bombers. The previously excited atmosphere of the masses turned to terrified panic in seconds. Klaus von Ferentiel, an SS officer laying injured in a military hospital, missing half his hip at the time, recalls how he felt it simply couldn't be true when people started to panic due to Dresden having openly been declared a hospital town. Surely, these fellow Christians, these supposedly civilized men of Western civilization, couldn't commit such an obvious war crime. Tons and tons of bombs began hurtling down to earth. Almost immediately, entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The variety of fancy bombs hitting them, designed to cause maximum death and destruction. Centuries-old cathedrals and palaces were wiped out. The masses of civilians at the railroad station were torn to unrecognizable pieces. The circus performers for the Fasching festival and their animals were ripped from the face of the earth. The crowded streets, were a scene of unimaginable horror. The city had no anti-aircraft defences to speak of, and the planes were flying so low that they could see the masses of costumed partygoers in the streets. They dropped the bombs anyway. The hospitals were clearly seen directly ahead of them on a night as bright as day, Red Cross painted on the roof. They deliberately targeted them anyway. The cross became a target rather than something to avoid. Eventually, what seemed like an eternity was over in 30 minutes, and the all-clear signal was sounded. The fire brigade of not only Dresden itself, but of the outlying communities, descended on the Saxon capital to fight the flames. An endless stream of Red Cross workers appeared to rescue who they could from the miles and miles of destruction. The ancient capital of the Wettin dynasty was now no more than a pile of burning rubble. The 60-year-old zoo inspector, Otto Sailor Jackson, recalled what he saw when he came back to check on his beloved animals. The elephants gave spine-chilling screams. Their house was still standing, but an explosive bomb of terrific force had landed behind it, lifted the dome of the house, turned it around, and put it back again. And the huge iron sliding doors, which shut off the house from the terraces, had been lifted off their hinges. When I and some of the other men managed to break into the elephant house, we found the stable empty. For a moment, we stood helpless, but then the elephants told us where they were by their heart-breaking trumpeting. We rushed out onto the terrace again. The baby elephant was lying in the narrow barrier moat on her back, her legs up to the sky. She had suffered severe stomach injuries and could not move. An elephant had been flung clear across the barrier moat and the fence by some terrific blast, and just stood there trembling. We had no choice but to leave these animals to their fate for the moment. Mr. Jackson continued to another area of the zoo, where he encountered a terrified monkey which rushed at him, screaming for help. To Jackson's horror, he saw the monkey had nothing but stumps for arms. Jackson drew his pistol and put his beloved hysterical monkey out of its agony. Rescue work continued elsewhere in the city. Most of it was pointless, but for the survivors' own conscience, and to distract them from sitting there, going over what they had just witnessed in their heads, they carried on. What the citizens of Dresden had already seen was bad enough, but at 1:30 a.m, the ground began to shake beneath them. The terrified voice of the announcer blared out over the few radios that still functioned, telling everyone to get to shelter, and that another wave of bombers was coming. Over 1,000 Allied bombers came flying overhead, low enough to see the masses of dead, mostly women and children, as well as those still living, getting themselves to shelter as fast as they could. No mercy was shown. Over 1,000 bombers dropped not only the usual payload of bombs, but thousands of incendiary bombs. These bombs were timed to land and fall amongst the debris into every nook and cranny. Basements all over the city, filled with masses of terrified civilians, were suddenly filled with these fiery canisters. Most locals had no idea of the thought process behind how these bombs were used, but the Allies did. They had deliberately flattened the city hours earlier so that they could now drop these incendiaries to cause the maximum amount of death. The city went up like a tinderbox. The wounded SS officer describes his attempt to free himself from the hospital of hell. Now I was in the open, no longer surrounded by walls, but by flames instead. No path was recognizable between the buildings, no obvious path of escape, because walls were collapsing and adding to the heaps of rubble. The suction in the flames was so strong, even pieces of clothing, which I had hurriedly picked up and thrown over myself, began to smoulder. Because of the flying sparks, my eyes had become useless. I was blind. Small holes must have been burnt into my cornea, which were incredibly painful. They made it impossible for me to open my eyes even briefly, just to see where I was. Temperatures in the inner city, where the fires were beginning to congregate and burn the hottest, were upwards of 3,000 degrees. Almost every material liquefied like it was nothing, and the flames were becoming not just fires, but a firestorm. Wandering or blinded citizens who took a wrong turn down a street were sucked into the vortex, never to be seen again. The SS man had resigned himself to fate. One could forecast what must happen next. The oxygen in the air becomes completely burnt away, so one becomes unconscious and hardly notices that one is burning to death. Blind, I accepted that this must happen. Suddenly, someone touched my shoulder and asked me to come along. He had found a way through the rubble to the outside, and so, holding onto the arm of a comrade, I was led through burning Dresden. End quote. People were fleeing in all directions to escape the madness. One woman describes how she saw a woman carrying a baby trip over, and before the baby could touch the ground, it literally flew in an arc as it was sucked into the vortex. The woman simply laid on the ground, in shock. Sparks of flames would attach themselves to people's clothing and ignite them. Those wandering to safety are on the clock as their skin is literally peeling before their eyes from the heat. Many went insane from the shock of the situation and started shouting incoherent nonsense or cursing the Allied terror bombers in the sky who had done this to them, wondering what they had done to deserve this fate. Many could not take it anymore and simply fell to the ground, being engulfed in flames. Through sheer will, some would get up and continue on, the fear of burning alive keeping them going. Some made it, most did not. A spectator on the hills outside of Dresden described the unbelievable scenes they witnessed. I did not understand what my eyes were seeing. I stood in the darkness, paralysed, numbed, with my eardrums aching from the hellish uproar. It was simply beyond comprehension, beyond the wildest imagination. It actually seemed unreal. I saw the rising of a flaming sea, which inundated the entire city in one huge glowing wave. The entire area was in flames. Huge red and yellow tongues of fire were roaring towards the sky. Streaming, trembling, madly onrushing clouds, intermingled with brilliant white, red and yellow explosions, out of which the big bombers seemed to rise like flocks of giant birds. Without ever having been through a big air raid before, I knew at once that something quite different was happening. After 30 minutes, the attack was broken off. Allied pilots after the war spoke of how they could literally see women, children, dogs, and all sorts moving below on the streets as they dropped their bombs on them, and how terrible they felt afterwards. However bad they felt, it changed nothing. All these innocent civilians, most of whom who had never even heard to fly, were now dead. Rescue teams poured into the city, slowly edging their way towards the centre, where the inferno was at its strongest. They saw people clinging to railings, only to be sucked away by the inferno towards the centre, never to be seen again. The streets stunk of sewage, blood, gas, and fat, along with every other smell imaginable that had been whipped up by the firestorm. The bodies they found varied. There was literally dozens of different ways that people had died, from people simply being crushed by debris to people glued to the boiling pavement. One rescuer describes how the dead in the streets resembled logs more than people, that they were so burnt. One found a mother and a child stuck together, charred into one piece by the heat. You could only roughly see the outline of the child in its mother's arms. Another describes the horrifying scenes which caused her to burst into tears as she watched dead pregnant women be removed from the hospital, their bellies burst open, and the child inside torn to pieces. Zoo animals were wandering the streets, making sounds of horror. Those at the train station, who had gathered in their thousands, were slaughtered to a man. Literally nobody underground had survived. They had died of the smoke and carbon monoxide poisoning. The local parks were a scene of total death and destruction. The RAF knew that the civilians would flee to these open spaces to escape the flames, so they hit the parks particularly hard to kill as many people as they could. The survivors began to assemble in whatever open spaces still remained. Individuals became a mass as they all trudged along towards the bombed out main park, each person injured in their own unique way, but just relieved to be alive. The relief didn't last long. The air raid sirens blared again, and a mass of US fighters came swarming from the sky, opening fire at the masses of refugees, tearing them to pieces. They hit them in the parks, they hit them in the columns fleeing the city, they hit them everywhere they could find them. One even deliberately targeting the last living giraffe, as well as others like deers and other animals at the zoo, in front of zookeeper Sailor Jackson's eyes. The raid lasted 10 minutes, but it happened again, and again, and again. Day after day, these fighters returned to strafe the fleeing columns of refugees. Barely a soldier was among them. When all was said and done, these were the figures. A month after the massacre, the Dresden police chief reported that over 200,000 dead bodies had been recovered from the ruins, not counting those where nothing was left, as they had been boiled into nothingness. The chief later updated his numbers to 250,000. The International Red Cross estimated that 275,000 died. Because of the sheer number of refugees in the city at the time, and how many bodies simply didn't exist anymore, many credible historians or others put the numbers at between 300,000 and 400,000 dead. When the reports flooded back to the rest of Germany, people were horrified. Goebbels let go of his persona of stoicism that he had kept up during the war, and in private was a broken, crying mess. Back in Britain, the papers celebrated the news that the 7th largest city in Germany had been wiped off the map, and that all these people were now dead. Some men, who still had some good in them, were furious, however. One man went berserk in the House of Commons, wondering why on earth that they had just committed such an obvious sick act of genocide when the war was clearly on the verge of being won. Most outrage was directed at Arthur Harris, Chief of Bomber Command. He didn't care, however, and Churchill shielded him from any criticism. The innocents were their target, and they couldn't be happier with the results. German factories could be up and running again in a few weeks, but it would take 21 years to raise a new worker, Harris said. Some men of the RAF felt they had been lied to, which was odd, considering they were low enough to see the lies for themselves firsthand. We were told at the briefing that there were many thousands of panzer troops in the streets, either going to or coming back from the Russian front, one said. My personal feeling is that if we'd been told the truth at the briefing, some of us wouldn't have gone. After the war, one pilot, whose eyes had been opened, said Butcher Harris didn't give a damn how many men he lost, as long as he was pounding the shit out of German civilians. Churchill publicly spoke about how maybe a change of strategy was needed in the wake of all this destruction, but this was just words. That same month, Pforzheim in western Germany was utterly flattened, killing 20,000 people in 19 minutes, and then the hospital city of Wurzburg was turned into an inferno too. Open season was declared on the German countryside, and anything was fair game for Allied fighters. Children in schoolyards, barn animals, trucks, farmers, anything. Trains were one of the main targets, whether military or civilian. Thousands of Jews were killed as they were shipped between one bombed camp or the other, only to have their train car, in which they were packed in like sardines, lit up by Allied fighter pilots. Many Germans agreed with Goebbels' proposal that they disregard the Geneva Convention. His thoughts was that the Allies had already thrown this treaty out of the window with their mass killing of civilians. Thousands were itching to kill any downed Allied airmen in retaliation for their loved ones killed. Hitler, however, absolutely forbid it. 99% of Allied prisoners of war would make it home after the war. I'll take things full circle to the video I mentioned at the start of this video. The most popular video on YouTube, attempting to justify this act of genocide, only states this single reason in the entire video titled, Dresden, a justifiable target.
Then in 1945, Dresden was definitely a military target. Dresden was a key junction in Germany's railway system, with rail lines extending from the city in multiple directions. By the time it was bombed, Dresden was one of the final lines of supply for the Germans on the Eastern Front, namely what was left of Army Groups Center and South, with thousands of soldiers passing through on rail lines every day. So this bombing was definitely strategic and was a great help to the Soviets in the East.
This is an interesting attempt to justify what happened at Dresden, but it's simply not a justification. In what way is American fighters afterwards targeting civilian columns or congregations of them at the parks, destroying the railway junction? In what way is incinerating between 200,000 and 400,000 people an acceptable justification for stopping troops which could simply be redirected around the city? In what way is deliberately creating a firestorm going to stop a railway any better than other means at the disposal of the Allies that would cause far fewer or no civilian casualties? The answer is A, it wasn't about railways, and B, Arthur Harris, and by extension, perhaps Churchill, wanted to kill as many German civilians as they physically could. These people were targeted because they were German. It didn't matter that they had committed no crimes. It didn't matter that they were children. It didn't matter that thousands were refugees fleeing death and destruction in the East, beyond the comprehension of the average Brit or American at the time. This was a targeted genocide, and it was one of the worst acts ever committed by the human race in all of our history, and no YouTuber sat an ocean away 70 years later can alter the facts of that matter. It feels wrong to promote my Patreon or anything else as I normally would at the end of the video, so I'll leave with a single quote I used from Arthur Harris in this video, which removes all doubt as to the purpose of this event. German factories could be up and running again in a few weeks, but it would take 21 years to raise a new worker.